a while?
Katie lived on the corner of Concord and 3rd Street, and David and I lived on the corner of Concord and City Park.
Oh, okay.
And there was a little house in between. And Katie would tell her guests that that was her guest house, and David and I would tell our guests it was our guest house.
And, she had been down here a long time. Her family was in the brewery business, right?
Yes, Born Brewery. And the matter of fact, the building that they're going to restore, which used to be the Salvation Army, that was her family's building.
Oh.
And I don't know how they used it, but it must have been like maybe the packing place or whatever, because it has, I think, 2 or 3 floors in that building.
Well, you're one of the few charter members we've been able to get to come talk to us, so I want to hear a little bit of the story again that you told us at G. Michael's that day about how you came to be associated with the German Village Society in those very, very early days. Could you tell me that story again?
Sure. David and I lived at the Oak Street apartments there on corner of Oak Street and bad. Oak Street and Grant. Okay? And we lived there for about a year, and we started thinking about wanting to get a house as a result of having gone to Williamsburg. We went to Williamsburg for the weekend, and we were fascinated by what they had done there and those cute little houses and so forth. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be kind of nice if we got an old house? When we said old, meaning cheap, right? So we scouted around in Clintonville and went to Arlington, and then, of course, I grew up in the South End, and I sort of would come through here when I was driving and so forth. So David and I came scouting down here, and we saw this house on the corner of Concord and City Park. And the reason for wanting to move down here, it was close to downtown. David worked at Went Bristol. I worked at Nationwide Insurance. And we thought, well, we wouldn't have to drive our cars. We could leave our cars home and we could take the bus or walk back and forth. And the other thing was that we just had this idea of fixing up a house. But after we had scouted out the neighborhood and so forth, we thought, well, the least we could do is buy the house, fix it up inside, and do nothing outside so we wouldn't be too pretentious, because the neighborhood was a little bit shoddy and run down. Most of our neighbors were elderly people. There were a few neighbors that had children, and I would say that practically all the houses from Whittier as far down to Deschler were probably rental houses. Very few people actually owned their houses because so many of the original families after the war or during the war moved out of this area and went to the suburbs. So we lucked out, and the people who sold us the house, they hadn't been there but a few months. They came back up from Florida thinking they wanted to come back to Ohio. And after they got there, they must have immediately decided they didn't want to stay, because when we went to look at the house, they hadn't even unpacked yet. So consequently, with a little bit of bargaining and so forth, we got that house for a good price.
And you were there for how long?
David and I were there together for 42 and a half years, and then I lived there for almost another 2 years before I sold it, after David passed away. Right.
And what about those early days with Frank Fetch calling and saying, come to a meeting? Tell me that again. About that meeting down in Schiller Park.
Well, the meeting at Schiller Park was just people calling. Everyone said we're having a meeting, went down there, and of course Frank Fetch presided, and he made a very convincing presentation. We sort of were quite doubtful how all this could happen, but Frank, having the connections that he had with downtown because he worked for the city, plus Frank he was a very, almost you might call it curmudgeon, but he was very good and very fair, and he would do anything in the world for you if it was the right thing to do.
So there was this meeting, and it was pretty well attended too, wasn't it?
Yes. When we talked earlier, I had told you there were about 85 people there, or 75, and just recently I read something that, as a result of that exhibit upstairs, I read that it was close to maybe 180 people there, more than what I remembered. Right.
So what, did you and David become pretty active in the events down here?
I did from the very beginning, but David was never too much to get involved with things like that. And matter of fact, he was not even an official member of the German Village Society.
Really?
Mm-hmm. He just had this idea that maybe the less people know about two guys living together, that would be probably the best thing, you know.
Was it uncomfortable or doing that, or did the neighborhood make you feel wanted?
I'll tell you, as I told you, the neighborhood were mostly elderly people, and we sometimes, of course, associated with them, spoke with them, and then we got neighborly, meaning that sometimes they would need an errand run, and I would run the errand. Sometimes after they got to know us better, they knew David was a pharmacist, so they would ask if he could fill their prescription and bring it home. And even sometimes, because a lot of those people probably on welfare hadn't had their welfare check and needed the prescription filled, well, David would fill it for them, and then when they got their welfare check, they would pay him back, you know. So we had a very good, friendly neighborhood, and as it started developing and people were leaving, and when I say leaving, most of the people that left because they passed away, and new people coming in, David and I always made it a point to, if someone left, like going to live with a family or going to the nursing home or into a retirement home, we always had a little send-off with the neighbors and so forth. And then when new people came in, we invited the new people in and invited the neighbors in and so forth. So eventually, with all these connections, Katie one time said, you know, this City Park gang is just wonderful. So from that point on, it was always called the City Park Gang.
And then, as the neighborhood progressed and more people moved in and more people fixed up houses, you had more instances of gay couples, men living with men down here, and it became very accepted.
Right, exactly. You know, when two women lived together, it was never questioned. But the minute two guys lived together, it was always questioned. But because we sort of maybe opened up the doors, because our neighbors, when two other people would move in, they would become part of the crowd, you know. So I think anytime two fellows moved in, they thought we got new neighbors, we'll be invited.
So you're just killing them with kindness.
Right, right.
So you've seen a lot transpire over 50 years. You've seen the neighborhood really come up. What's that been like to see this neighborhood just grow around you?
Well, let me tell you, sometime, and I used to tell Katie McClure this story, and she couldn't believe it. But when David and I would come home at night, and we were in our car together, we'd turn off of 3rd Street onto Concord, and from the house where Katie lived, that was quite run down. And it had an open porch, and when the car would come around, the rats would run across the street. Really. Yeah. And the people that lived there were nice people, but they were poor, and their front porch looked like something that you would see when you were down in Georgia driving through the country down there. No slats, and the dogs, they had 3 or 4 dogs, and they would stay underneath the porch. And well, I was going to mention something else about the house. Oh, Katie's house was built by Fern Sharp's grandfather. And I think that's the name I was trying to remember. Fern Sharp's grandfather. And she lived at the Deschler. And when they were getting ready to tear down the Deschler, I'm trying to think, it'll come to me. These friends of hers, she said something about, well, I don't know what I'm going to do because I'm going to have to move. And they said to her, well, you know, you have your grandfather's house there in German Village. Why don't you think about restoring that house and move down there? Which, I'll think of the names in a minute, which that's what they actually did. And she came down. Now, she would always wave every morning when she went by in the cab, but she wasn't very social. And she never became part of the so-called social City Park gang, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, the social aspects of it, of course, we're talking about the society and what they've done. And a lot of people have told us very early on the society was very, very important, of course, in helping foster the restoration of the neighborhood, of the buildings itself. And then, as the buildings started becoming fixed up and becoming showpieces, then the society took on another role of being a way for people to mingle and have fun together. And
by having the house and garden tour. And well, in the early days, the only thing we really had socially was the house and garden tour until it really got organized and got big and so forth. And then from that point on, after we became a so-called society and we had the commission to work with and so forth, that's when we started having all these other opportunities to get people to come down here and get together and mingle.
And did that enrich your life and others?
Oh, certainly, yes. And you know, because German Village was getting so well known, it was very. Anytime you mentioned that you lived in German Village, whoever you were talking to wanted to know what that was all about, you know. And before you know it, they were down here.
There was a lot of excitement.
Right. Matter of fact, Surratt, in the early days, Don and John Surratt, we were having dinner one night. Do you remember the Maramore restaurant?
No.
Okay, the Maramore restaurant on Broad Street, between 3rd and 4th. Very nice restaurant. David and I were there, and John and his friend were there, and we were telling them where we lived and so forth, and John said, you know, I've heard a lot about that. Well, the next thing, we had invited them down to our house to see what we had done, and they really got interested, and so they started looking, and they ended up buying the house on the corner of 5th and Jackson. And they completely redid it, and that house was always a place for people to see. And you know, back in those days, before we had the big organized tours, we always had little tours. Mm-hmm. And he was always very willing to show his house, you know.
What was your favorite time of year down here?
Early spring.
Were you
and Christmas, yeah.
Were you a big gardener?
Yes. David and I our whole backyard was in hosta, all kinds of sizes and varieties, and we had lilac bushes on the street side, which we kept at a lower level, and of course when they would bloom, the whole neighborhood would smell like lilacs. Right.
And I bet Christmas was always pretty down here.
Yeah,
it is
Christmas
now.
Was always pretty. Right.
Were there any? Do you remember any like decorating contests and things
Well,
like that?
you know, when we started having the at Christmas time, we would put the lights out in our little paper bags, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and of course at that time it was only done in front of each person's home. We never did it up and down the street like it's being done now. See how that thing has just expanded from, yeah.
And that's how a lot of these things work, don't they? Somebody has an idea, it starts small,
Right.
and then
Exactly.
Why don't you get David to just on tape talking
Bill.
about, Bill, that your house was one of the first houses on tour.
oh, right. Tell me about that. I forgot because you've told me before, but I'd like to hear it
Okay.
for tape about your house being on the first tour.
As I said, we didn't do much with the outside, but I think Frank Fett probably had invited himself in, and when sometime later we got a telephone call from Shirley Keats, I think it was, and she said we're having this we're organizing this house and garden tour, and we'd like to know if you'd be interested in having the house on tour. Well, we were kind of proud of what we had done, and by that time the yard didn't look as bad as it did because we had about 2 years before we actually had the German Village Society. So we had started working on the outside slowly, and when we had that open, at that time, whatever you wanted to do, you did yourself. Like, for instance, now they've furnished runners, and people get flowers, and they have hosts and so. Back in those days, we had to put down our own runners, and we had to do our own decorating with flowers and so forth, and had to even have our own host. David and I were hosts, along with his mother, and we had a friend, Lillian Smith. And so, and at that time, people were allowed to go upstairs on Sunday. So, the line was kind of long and kind of slow. So we had to have people upstairs as well as downstairs and outside. So
Was it just one day then, or was it always
one day,
Saturday?
and it started at 12 o'clock and ended at 6 o'clock, and the tickets were $1 for the tour.
How many people did you have that day?
Well, supposedly, I don't know if you saw that article upstairs, supposedly it was around 3,000 people.
How many did you expect?
Had no idea. Matter of fact, Shirley Keats, I'm sure you heard this, Shirley Keats said when we were talking about this, and they said they were going to charge $1, she said, I can't imagine who would pay $1 to go through these houses.
Lots of people.
Doesn't that sound like Shirley? Did you know her husband, Phil?
We knew them both a little
Yeah.
bit, yeah.
But well, I'll tell you, just Phil was always willing to do everything and anything you wanted done. So one time, David and I got this idea we wanted to open up our fireplace because it was a gas-grated fireplace built in, and it had a chimney and all that business. So he came by, and he came in and looked at it and got his ladder and went up, came down, and he said, yes, I can do this. I'll be back next week. Well, 6 months later, we still hadn't seen him. Three years later, we still hadn't seen him. He never did come back. But in the meantime, it was a good thing he didn't, because we decided not to open it up and actually have a fireplace there. And of course, Durier's, do you know Durier's?
How?
They opened up their fireplace, and you heard what happened.
No.
Well, they had just finished decorating and had it all painted, new carpet and so forth. Then they got the idea that they wanted to open up the fireplace. So the guy came and said, oh, yes, we can do this. So when he started, evidently bricks had come together somewhere in the chimney, and all these years, all that soot and so forth was falling off and piling up on those bricks.
Oh.
And when they opened up the fireplace, all that came down, and Phyllis said it was like a black fog.
Just all of it at one time coming down.
And what a mess. And they had to replace the carpeting, they had to just everything, because it was all that black oily soot,
Hmm.
There have been some wild stories down here about what people, well, when David and I were doing our house, we had a chandelier, an old-fashioned, not an old-fashioned, got a new chandelier, and was sort of attached to this iron rod. So David got the ladder, because we were going to take it down and get a new one. So he got the ladder, And David was a smoker, and he got up there on the ladder and took a puff of the cigarette and sort of started unscrewing, put the cigarette back in his mouth, unscrewed, and then he got smoke in his eyes. He put the cigarette out, and he reached up there, and the pipe came down, and it was a gas pipe. And it was swishing out, and I got panicking. I ran downstairs, and I had to find a big pair of pliers or something to turn that thing off. Or that would have been the end of the house and the end of Bill and David.
You didn't even realize it was a gas pipe.
No. And you know, I still hear stories, especially people out in Brighton Road area. They're still talking about these light fixtures that are connected to gas pipes.
One of the stories I think you told us was about that sense of camaraderie when people, so many of you were fixing up houses that it was always somebody would finish a project, you'd all go and celebrate and drink and
Yes.
look at everyone's handiwork. I think that would be kind of fun to have on.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I think that was sort of part of the entertaining, like, you know, in our own little neighborhoods. And then, of course, you know, we spread out and we started getting to know new people. And, of course, when they were doing restorations, they would ask for advice or comments and so forth. And then when it was all said and done, of course, we'd be invited in to see what had been done. And, of course, back in those days, everyone brought something, you know. So
you got to meet a lot of people,
Right.
trade a lot of ideas. And,
right.
well, that's neat.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think that's-
All right. Anything else you want to add?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, we've had some big snowstorms here. And I think it was probably in the 70s, late 70s, when we had that big snow. David and I had a little Volkswagen. And that was the only car in the neighborhood that was running up and down the streets. So consequently, a lot of little old ladies and little old men couldn't get out. So we would check on them and, oh yeah, could you get this? And of course, our store was the Big Bear at that time. So we would go to the Big Bear, and then one time David and I said, well, why don't we make a big pot of beef vegetable soup and have these people in? So that's what we did. We invited the neighborhood in, and they just loved us for it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Bill, thank you very, very
Yeah.
much.
Okay.
All right.
Good. I don't know what you can do.
I had asked somebody what it was like for some of these big, who were kind of developing businessmen, what was it, did they accept gay men? And they said the property values kept going up, so there was no question. They were accepted.
And to be honest with you, the little old ladies were so happy to have some young men around. Really?
Yeah.
Well, tell me that part, because you had said that once before, but I'd like to hear you say that on tape about the brewery district and
Right.
how one got.
And you can understand this. If there hadn't been a brewery district, the people who established the brewery district, of course, were bringing all their families and relatives and friends over from Germany to work in the brewery district. And at that time, there was very small, almost nothing down here as far as living houses and so forth. So for the Germans to come, they had to live somewhere. So that's what brought them down here. And most of the Germans, being that they were working class, start building what we called those little Dutch bricks, story and a half. And of course, you know, they're called shotgun houses. And you know why? Because you open up the front door and you can shoot a shotgun right through the house, right through the back door. So you know they weren't pretentious.